Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about gamification and threat modeling. Abhishek showed you how you can scale it. This is another way of scaling approaching that same problem. Hang on one second. I've got audio coming through from the other side, which I will kill. There we go. So gamification of threat modeling. This is going to be an introduction to OWASP Cornucopia, a project that I'm one of the co-leads on, and something called Copy. So threat modeling is becoming an essential part of building secure systems. U.S. Executive Order 14028 to improve nations' cybersecurity mandates threat modeling as part of the minimum standard for verification. OWASP Top 10 from 2021 puts insecure design at number 4 of the top 10 risks to business. Now, scaling threat modeling to cover your whole organization, you need to put the capability into the hands of the right people, into the development teams. Agile threat modeling provides a focus for development teams to think critically about system design and how it can be attacked. So let's jump into it. Threat modeling is about seeing your app as an attacker would. Abhishek did a really good job taking you through some of the original things. I'm not going to run through this in any detail, but that's STRIDE, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. STRIDE is 22 years old. And a couple of years ago, Adam Shostak did a write-up on it on its 20th anniversary on dark reading. And it's still well used, as Abhishek showed you. They're making good use of it. Problem is that threat modeling traditionally happens in a waterfall development process right up the frontier. So this is old school development, waterfall. This is where you get to do your threat modeling, right? You get one shot to do it right. And if you mess it up, you end up fixing all your problems in prod. The same slide or same view of things that Abhishek showed as well, agile development process. We get a chance to change things here. But it is a small release, right? So each time we go through this, we get to change things. We get to review things. We get to modify what the output looks like, what the product looks like. And we can take input from here, how it operates, and here, how we do testing. And actually, we can use the entire cycle of the application to rethink about how we're going to do things better. And that's also true for security. One of the slides Abhishek showed talked briefly about the 4 questions, about the 4 areas of security. And these 4 questions are, what are we working on? It's essential to have a clear view on the system that you're threat modeling and the scope that we control and what's outside that scope. We need to know what could go wrong. There's potentially infinite universe of calamities, right? Cornucopia, what we're going to talk about just now, helps us to focus on the possible with a relatively simple framework. Then we go on to what are we going to do about it? So once you've established that an issue is a real issue, potential issue, then you have to capture the work that comes out of that. With Agile threat modeling, this goes straight into the backlog for prioritization. And then did we do a good job? Again, with Agile, because we go through that infinite loop, we've got lots of chance to review how well the work we've done in the previous iteration has affected the threats that we're seeing in the next one. So Agile threat modeling takes time, right? And it's, we design for threat modeling using the design phase, but it does take time. The larger the piece of functionality that we're going to be working on, the more time it takes. And as the product evolves, it's going to change over time. Our understanding must also evolve. This leads to a couple of issues, though. Number one is we tend to model things too late. It's generally done mostly by security. And when do we, the security folks, get our hands on designs? It's not normally before coding starts. And if it is, are we now holding up delivery because they can't start working at something? So Stephen and Avi, who run the OWASP threat modeling project, talk about when threat modeling should happen, ideally. Now, of course, it doesn't tell us anything we didn't know, right? The sooner the better, but never too late. The second problem that comes up is how much time is enough time? And Adam Shostak, in his blog on magical approaches to threat modeling, asks for a fourth option to the three magical approaches he describes, one that doesn't result in too many threats. The question is, when should we stop looking for threats? And that's when our threat models are going to be good enough, I think, right? Inaccurate models don't help. So we need to have good enough threat models. George Box says, all models are wrong, but some can be useful. He goes on to say, is the model good enough for this particular application? So we have our answers now. We need a threat model that's good enough. We need to build it using what time we can afford, using whatever time we have available, and as early as possible in the process as we can get. In our world, that tends to be at story scrubbing or backlog grooming. Call that whatever you like, but it's the point in time before stories are added to a sprint to be worked on, and it's where the acceptance criteria are defined for this piece of work we're going to be building, the piece of functionality we're going to be building. This work always happens, right? We're always going to be looking at what's coming up next on the backlog, and we're expecting non-functional requirements to come out of the process. So it's time boxed, it's time that we're already spending, and we expect to have acceptance criteria, which would include those non-functional requirements. And we stop when we have enough information to build the thing that we want to build, when we can fulfill the acceptance criteria, the definition of done. Remember, we get to iterate, right? So this is not a once and done. We can get to do more later. But why do we gamify threat modeling? This is kind of the crux of this presentation and why Cornucopia and why Copy exist. And it's basically because we like to compete. Threat modeling isn't fun, usually because it involves security folk tearing apart things that other people have built. And that's not particularly pleasant for the developers who are building it, unless the security team, are psychopaths. But it's not fun for us either, right? Because we don't actually think in terms of breaking down the thing that you've built and showing you how horrible it is. But we think in terms of building this new thing, this threat model, this thing that we need to create. But games are fun, especially when there are prizes. And, whenever we run through these exercises with customers, we definitely try to ensure that there's somebody who's forking out for the prizes. We use two games to do threat modeling, Cornucopia, which is what Copy was built to do online, and Elevation of Privilege. Now, Elevation of Privilege is the next iteration of threat modeling that was kind of codified in the threat modeling book that Adam Shostak wrote. It takes the security's point of view, and it uses Stride, and it breaks down threats using Stride. So if you're using Stride in your organizations, then the gamification version of that is going to be Elevation of Privilege. Why Cornucopia, though? Well, mostly because Cornucopia is very developer focused. So it looks at things from the viewpoint of a developer, from how developers look at the world. And it builds on the shoulders of giants. It leverages other OWASP projects like the ASVS, and other projects outside of OWASP like SafeCode to look for the particular types of threats while you're building particular features. So this is OWASP Cornucopia, right? It's a game built on a number of very well thought through projects. As I said, ASVS, SCP, App Sensor from OWASP, SafeCode, and then MITRE's Common Attack Pattern Enumeration Classification. It takes in some architectural designs, data flow diagrams, like you saw Aminesh talking about in the Irius Risk product. Just on that, reminds me, Irius Risk is a great product, but as OWASP, we don't recommend any specific products. Test the ones that are available to you if you're going to use a product and see if it works for you. So we start off with the architectural designs and some data flow diagrams, but don't get too hung up on the requirements here, mostly because they may not be accurate by the time you get a look at them or by the time they're created, at least initially. What is most important, though, is you need some time to play and you need as many folks who are going to be building or testing the features that you're about to build as you can get involved in the process. And you need a will to get into it. You need someone to actually want to have this happen. The outputs of Agile threat modeling are going to be, this is the Cornucopia score sheet, but it's going to result in some existing stories getting some security acceptance criteria, because security is a non-functional requirement, right? And it'll put some security into the context of a functional part of code. So this piece of code is going to do something. What is the security for the thing that it's going to do? And around those things that we, are building this feature for. And it'll probably help you update those diagrams. The ones that I said were probably out of date. If you're doing threat modeling, you're probably going to get a chance to actually update the diagrams. Often we see data flow diagram put up on the board, and halfway through the discussion, someone will go, wait, but hang on, there's this piece here now. We need to think about how that's dealing with a piece of data. And sure enough, we can add that to what's being shown. Add that to what's visible in those diagrams afterwards. The outcomes of Cornucopia or Agile threat modeling. Well, threat modeling can't just be an academic process, right? It must change the system in order for it to be useful. So we identify some issues, we get them on the backlog, and then we get product owners to sponsor that piece of work that's on the backlog so it actually gets fixed. Now, Cornucopia is a card game, and I have decks of cards lying around all over the place here. But as a card game, it consists of several suits. First of which is authentication. It's a light blue colored suit, and they represent identity or who you are. Now, identity can be anything from an individual account, a multi-user system, all the way through to an API key that's assigned to a particular third-party application. But the point of it is to uniquely enough identify who or what is connecting to the solution. Different systems will have different requirements for identifying who in order to determine who did what or is trying to do what. And they'll be based on the type of system it is, how it's used, what kinds of functions it provides. But as a general rule, you want identity and auth-C as a result to be as specific as possible. Whenever you're dealing with any kind of identity in any kind of feature you're building, you should be thinking about how we're going to threat model that. The second suit is authorization, or auth-Z, to contrast it with auth-C, is a golden set of cards in Cornucopia, and it's the what you can do to balance out who you are. Auth-Z is about access control, and it limits what functions an identified user of a system can execute against which data. Now, access control is often a matrix of rights and privileges, often inherent to some structure the solution provides. And it's usually coupled to a user via some kind of role, so role-based access control. And whenever you're talking about adding functionality or new data types, you should hear authorization, auth-Z. And it should trigger the bell in your mind that says, let's do some threat modeling around this. Access control is one of the hardest things to test for in an automated way. And it's very closely tied to business logic and the functionality built into a solution. So properly planning for it is essential. That's one of the places where threat modeling is, I would say, essential. Next deck of cards is session management. It's the green cards in the deck, and it's how we review and check auth-C and auth-Z for functions being executed and data being accessed. Terms usually used to define sessions against web services. This was originally the web application deck. But when threat modeling a system, think of it as being related to auth-C and auth-Z and rechecking those things in terms of time and potentially dangerous actions. Dangerous actions being things like account deletion or bulk data deletion or bulk data exports or changing passwords or contact details or something like that. Session management is the security point that most keenly needs to be balanced against usability. Most secure session management is going to be reauth for every action, and reauth should be a lookup to make sure that access for this particular user is correct every time. Doesn't make it very usable though. So balance is required. Data validation and encoding. The silver cards in Cornucopia, these are every hacker's favorite. It's my favorite. And it's the cause of large chunks of the all the history of OWASP top 10 lists. Fundamental concern here is going to be, and the phrase that you have to start associating with DVE is trust boundaries. Essentially, trust boundaries are the lines that you walk across, or that you cross, whenever you move from trusted to untrusted, or from untrusted to trusted. And it's at that point you want to perform one of those DVE actions, right? Validating input from users or not trusting users is how we generally describe those things, but it is broader than that, right? Trust boundaries set the line to where that is. When you pull data into your safe space from outside, validate it. When you push data out of your trusted zone, you want to try and encode it. Trust boundaries are not fixed, and they're not a global thing. They're not something that we can define in a sweeping way. It's going to sit very much somewhere where the risk appetite of your company or your project or the implementation of this particular solution or the team that's writing the particular code sees trust as being. Some teams, it's the network layer, right? If it comes in or goes out over the wire, you need to do DVE. Others set it in like cluster level. If it's local to a community's cluster, it's all trusted. Those are both probably a little broader than I'd like. Some set it at the module or even function level within their own code, which is probably a little bit too granular. But whatever it is, whenever you cross that boundary, data validation and encoding needs to happen. Cryptography, our purple cards in the deck, they cover a broad spectrum of things like actual encryption, hashing, and even obfuscation. It doesn't cover encoding. Just to make it very clear, the crypto is about secrets and how we keep them. Encryption translates data into another form, into an encrypted form, so that only people with access to a secret key or a decryption key or a password or whatever it is can read that data. Encrypted data we call ciphertext. Unencrypted data is plain text. Obfuscation is the process of concealing data, so hiding it, so it's not obvious. The analogy I like to use here is the one about cover versus concealment, right? If someone's throwing snowballs at you and you stand behind a large scrub, it probably provides you the concealment. They may not see you, as well as cover. Even if they do see you, they can't hit you with a snowball. If they're using a paintball gun, then maybe you want to move behind a tree to gain cover because they might not see you through the shrub. If they shoot at the shrub, they might get through. If they're using a bazooka, then you probably want to upgrade your cover to a concrete bunker. The same is true with encryption versus obfuscation, right? Pick your strength of cover to match your target and the attacker that you have. Hashing is practice is using an algorithm to map data to a fixed length. We use it as an extreme form of encryption, one where there's no key, because we take something, we apply a function or an algorithm to it, and we end up with a secret that can never be decrypted. So it makes it impossible for that plain text to ever be recovered from the ciphertext. Encryption covers encryption at rest, and it also covers data on the move, so encryption in transit. It covers the whole suite of things there. That kind of is the top 5 of the decks, the top 5 of OWASP that the top 5 areas that you should be concerned with doing some threat modeling. There are other areas, of course, areas that don't fit neatly into one of those 5 discrete pockets. And they're all covered by the Cornucopia, the dark blue deck, which is a miscellaneous suite of the game. And it covers off all those other things, as I said. Many of the attacks have to do with people and processes, how they interact with security. Some of them reflect in some way less obvious or less direct attacks, like 4 or the 7 of Cornucopia deal with attribution, so identity suites to some degree. The 5 of Cornucopia covers things like trust boundaries, so some combination of DVE and auth-z. The rest are things like data exposure via error and exceptional handling through to denial of service, with a couple of stops along the way to cover off things like third-party libraries, the build tools that you use, security misconfigurations, etc., etc., etc. Often the suit is excluded when learning to play the game, but once the team is very familiar with the mechanism of doing trumping with the Cornucopia suit and the types of attacks that it covers, it's almost never excluded, mostly because that trump action is important to the gamification side of things, and also because it covers circumstances that you can't easily exclude. If the features you're dealing with don't have anything to do with cryptography, then you can remove the cryptography suit from the deck. How do you actually play the game? Well, there are 9 steps, and those steps range from filtering the deck, like I said, to remove particular cards, all the way through to adding items on the backlog. Fortunately, RBI, who I'll be talking about in just a second, kindly could put together a video explaining it all. And I won't play the video for you here. It's less than 15-minute long. It takes you through the whole game with some examples included. That is the URL for the video, and you can go check it out there. As I said, less than 15 minutes. It'll show you examples. It'll run you through exactly everything that you need to know to play the game. It is also linked from the Cornucopia project page. There are a couple of other videos, and that link there, more videos below, that cover pieces of this presentation in sort of a threat modeling in a minute approach. So 9 videos in total, that essentially 9 minutes that cover everything I'm going to talk about now, or I have talked about so far. But where have we done this before? So have we done this at scale? Have we shown what this can do? Well, RBI have about 1,500 developers. I talk about them here because they were kind enough to pay for and provide free back to the community that video. The video was actually used internally at RBI to scale out threat modeling, to help teach without having to train trainers, without having to send me even further around the world than I did. But with 1,500 developers, I probably ran about 100 games in a year to get things up and running. So about 1 in 10 at RBI are indeed developers. RBI is dealing with some hard problems. Most of those hard problems that they're trying to solve are data related. So threat modeling, where that data is going to end up, is incredibly important to them. Portions of their business provide transaction filtering to most of the top 10 banks worldwide. So their customers, well, you've seen how important threat modeling is to the banking industry. So their customers want to see that their software and their solutions are properly protected against threats. But RBI is also born from a bunch of smaller businesses that are used to working very agilely. And they don't want to lose that agility. They don't want to lose that flexibility they have. The full quote from Jeff, who is the CISO at RBI, is threat modeling with Cornucopia empowers engineers to expand their application security knowledge through thought-provoking challenges, which in turn allow them to move fast more securely. And it's all about moving fast more securely. That is the key thing here. But how do you make it work? How do you take this and actually do something with it in your own environments? Well, the first thing is use the decks. Like, don't just deal down through the deck and then try to match possible issues. It doesn't work. The gamification side of things, the actual competition, that's incredibly important. Actually make time to play the game. And as I said, playing the game as part of the backlog scrubbing session is the best place to do it. Change it up. Not all the features need to be threat modeled. This is a bit of a controversial statement, but the reality is not all features need to be threat modeled, or it's not always the case that threat modeling this feature, it makes sense now. It's down the line that we see that there's potential for threats to come into it. And use the systems we have available. So use the things that you can do. Now, we live in a world where potentially I can't sit down around a table with developers and play the game, so I don't get to break out my physical cards. But that's changing. So, maybe physical cards are a thing. But there are other options, and I'll show you Copy just now. these were the project milestones that we had along the way. We moved away from Microsoft Word, which is where the cards were originally designed. And literally there was just a Word document, and that Word document you had to then go and figure out a way to get print versions out of that out, or print them out onto card, make them double-sided. It was complicated. We've moved to a more Git-friendly format, so it's YAML now. The first versions of those builds, those automated builds, are done, along with whatever translations we have. So that's the repository, as you can see there. We are already triggering on changes to the main branch that Word and HTML versions of the files, as well as the Adobe InDesign versions, are being output. So, we can already generate the Adobe InDesign files, which means that you can take that to a professional print shop and get cards printed. Or track me down at a conference at some point, and I'll probably have a bunch of decks with me. That's usually the case. The next part is to try and get PDFs printed, because Word isn't universal. HTML from Word is relatively simple. I'm struggling with the PDF thing. I don't know that it's still necessary, but people still ask for it. The problem is building PDF from Word as a serverless part of my Git pipeline. It's a bit difficult. If you have some thoughts, please reach out and help me. And then we made an app. Physical decks are cool, very cool, and I never want them to go away. But as I said, not all teams are the same physical space. Even pre-pandemic and even post-pandemic, dev teams across the world have to work together. And you can make Cornucopia cards, physical decks, work remotely. I've done a bunch of sessions like that with a company called Agile Stationery, who actually make, I'll just shout out for them here, they make a much larger, prettier version of the deck, which is quite cool. I have done a few sessions like that, but it's not really easy for a project owner to set up a game. It's fairly complicated to do. There's now an easy way for a project owner just to hit create game and then sends out a link, and, a very interactive web service that deals out the deck to the players, and everyone can play anytime they want, anywhere they want. It's pretty cool, which I will show you now. As I said, there's still some next steps, right? There's still things that we need to do. Cornucopia relies on the work of other projects like ASVS, as I mentioned. Now that we can build from source, we'd like to update the mappings to those projects to make them more interactive, like direct linking to the sections, things like that. There was also never meant to be just an e-commerce edition. There are other versions we'd like to make. IoT version comes to mind. So get involved, please. If you want to help move some of these things forward, that's the project repository, project page itself, and the repository page as well. And the second thing you do is actually use Copy. We need more beta testers. And there is an email address. So that's the URL to go play. And there is an email address that will come into us directly for us to take a look at. Please do make use of it. I guess my next step is, there was a demo in the previous session. I probably should do some kind of demo as well. I should probably show you what it looks like. And I'll pull that up while I take a look at some questions that are coming in. So, Lego UCS, where can I get physical decks of Cornucopia and NL? On the same place where to download it is a link. You can reach out to Secure Delivery. So you can reach out to me at Secure Delivery, or reach out to inquiries at Secure Delivery, and we'll send you a deck. We have a couple of them with which I should have somewhere around here. We have a couple of them with our logos or some logos of Copy on them available. There isn't a tabletop simulator version, but there is, as I said, the online game. So this is what the Cornucopia Copy website looks like. It's simply copy.securedelivery.io. You can see that my privacy badger is very happy with me on this site, as there are no trackers. This is Secure Delivery contributing back to the project and contributing back to the community on this. You click start a new game. There's some explanation here. There'll probably be some videos at some point loaded up, but you can just skip straight past that. I mentioned that you can choose to play Cornucopia or Elevation of Privilege. There are cases where I think Elevation of Privilege is more logical or a better choice. Like if you're trying to do some threat modeling around infrastructure rather than application development, then probably EOP is a better choice. And at this point, you can select either of those two games. Both games work the same game mechanic. Both games will work in the same way. And it just depends which cards you have. Give give your game a name. And of course, you can put whatever you like in the name. And I'm 100% certain that somebody's going to try and do a SQL injection at this point. What that does is it creates a unique endpoint here. That your unique endpoint will allow you to share the game with individuals you want to play with. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that in here. And the irony is that's going to show up in the chat before it shows up on the screen. The first couple of people who jump in there, click join the game as player, fill in a name, and when I have a few, I will start a game. I'll choose to be one of the first ones. There are two modes of play, or two ways in which you can interact with the game. The first one is a player. Players get appended to that view there, which is the URL for this particular game, this particular session. Players get a player ID, which allows them to gain access to their own cards. I hope I'll get some people to join the game. If not, I'll have to create at least 3 players in order to play a game. Actually, let's just go with France. You'll notice that each of these endpoints is unique. I didn't do any login. I didn't have any, there's no identity. There's no access control. So if you're quick enough, you can probably steal my session. You can grab the ID and you can jump into it. But when you have at least 3 players, then you can click start game. And once the game is started, no one else can join. You'll see that there's 3 players. Anybody who connects to this link can watch the game that's in progress. And generally, the person who's the Scrum Master or possibly product owner or whoever it is who's helping to define what the
Rent, the link did not show up on the chat, so I don't know what you did there, but it didn't appear.
Didn't it? I thought I jumped straight into the chats of the YouTube chat. Anyway, here it is on the chat on the meeting invite. But anyway, all I wanted to show is that people can go on to the link into copy.security.io and just play their own games. But as a player, you get cards dealt to you, and you can see it's the same cards. They look identical to the cards that are actually in the Cornucopia box. If we were to play a EOP game, then they would look like the cards that are in the Elevation of Privilege deck. So they look like these deck of cards. And you just simply play by dragging a card up onto the game area. And the moment you've done that, anybody monitoring the game can see that the card's been played. The way you talk through the game, or the way you approach the game, is as described in the video and as described in the steps that I showed earlier. I play the card. I tell the team why I think this card is going to win. Other people on the team, not the person who played it, not the person who's observing, and not the person who's played the card, but the other 2 players get the opportunity to say, yeah, I think that's a good card. And the moment two players say that's a good card, it scores, and scoring is kept at the bottom here. And essentially, that's the game. Somebody plays a card, next person follows suit. The highest suit of the card, highest card of the suit played first wins a high card bonus. So as you can see, this is currently the highest card. It'd be hard to beat the queen, but if you did, you would then take that score. So if somebody played the king and it scored, oh, sorry. So play the king and it scored. Then you'll see that that high card has moved from front to down to here. And that's it. Please do, come back to the project and say, I'd like to help out with things. I haven't yet done a Dutch version, and theoretically I could, but I'd much rather that somebody else wrote the Dutch translation. So grab the YAML files, translate them to Dutch. It is literally just a YAML file that you need to worry about translating. Everything else will automatically generate from that. And that's really all I have. Last thing is that. So the links, a couple of the links that were probably too small to catch earlier, that executive order, if you're curious about it, the OWASP Top 10, Insecure Design, the Threat Modeling in a Minute playlist, as well as the video playthrough of how to play Cornucopia as a card game.